Peter Horde had never set out to kill a child, but when the opportunity presented itself, wrapped in the promise of money, he hadn't hesitated. Desperation made decisions easy, and Peter was a man who clung to every dollar as though it were his last. Some called it greed, he called it survival. His financial situation was dire, and his minimum wage job at a Shell gas station barely kept a roof over his head. Had it not been for the generosity of the Collins family, he likely wouldn't have been able to stay in his home as long as he had. Every summer, he worked for them, handling odd jobs around their lavish estate in exchange for generous compensation. The Collins were an enigma, immensely wealthy, though no one knew the true source of their fortune. Some whispered about illicit dealings, while others dismissed such claims, believing their wealth was simply inherited. Regardless of the truth, money was money, and that was the only thing that mattered to Peter. So when Gloria Collins appeared at his doorstep one humid August afternoon, he didn't hesitate to let her in. She stood on his porch, impeccably dressed in black despite the oppressive heat, her sleeves long, her demeanor as composed as ever. Before he could greet her, she cut in with a direct question. "May I come inside?" "Of course," Peter answered, holding the door open as she stepped in and settled onto his worn-out couch. She was, as always, the picture of perfection. Flawless blonde curls, smooth skin, and an air of effortless control. Even in casual conversation, she carried herself with a detached professionalism. "Shut the door, Peter. We need to talk," she instructed. Peter obeyed, closing the door with an uneasy click. "My husband and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately," she began. That alone was unusual. The Collinses were not a couple bound by love. They were business partners in all but name, their marriage devoid of warmth or passion. Peter raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Gloria exhaled slowly, the weight of whatever she was about to say making her appear older than her years. Then, in a voice devoid of hesitation, she said, "I want you to kill my son." Shock should have been Peter's first reaction. It wasn't. Kevin Collins was a bright-eyed, scrawny boy with hair so blonde it was almost white. He looked like a fragile stick figure in oversized glasses. And though Peter hadn't known for certain that the child had been an accident, he wouldn't have been surprised. It was clear to anyone who spent time around the Collins household that Kevin was unwanted. His parents had never made space for him in their lives, and they never intended to. Not because he was troublesome. On the contrary, Kevin was polite and hopeful, but because he expected love from a mother and father who had no intention of giving it. Every morning, his father, Harley Collins, would march out the door in a stiff business suit, disappearing until late in the evening. Gloria, meanwhile, spent her days absorbed in her online coursework, far more invested in the screen in front of her than the child who shared her home. But Kevin still tried. He still hoped. Peter recalled a night last summer when he had stayed late at the Collins estate, dusting the furniture in a nearby room. The walls were thin, and through them, he overheard Kevin's timid voice. "Mom, can you come here for a second?" Soft footsteps followed. Then Gloria's voice, clipped and impatient. "What is it?" "Kevin, do you think maybe you give me a goodnight kiss?" Gloria's response had been a quiet chuckle. Not the kind of laugh that warms a child's heart, but the kind that makes an observer's skin crawl. "Kevin," she said, exasperated, "your mother is very busy right now. I have a course I need to focus on." And just like that, the conversation was over. Now, as Peter stood in his dimly lit living room, Gloria's words still hanging in the air, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't horrified. He wasn't even surprised. "I don't have time for things like this." And with that, Gloria had left the room. Peter remained frozen for a moment, the dusting cloth limp in his hands, just long enough to hear the quiet sobs begin. Kevin was crying. The boy had always longed for his parents' attention. Craved it, really. He wanted them to laugh with him, to play games, to take him on trips to caravans, to create memories together. More than anything, He wanted to be loved, but Gloria and Harley Collins had no such desires. To them, Kevin was nothing more than an irritating gnat, buzzing in their ears, a nuisance they wished would simply go away. So when Gloria had stood in Peter's living room that muggy August day and asked him to kill her son, his first emotion hadn't been shock. It had been curiosity. "When me?" he had asked, his voice even though his mind raced. Gloria's piercing blue eyes locked onto his without a flicker of hesitation. "Because," she said, her voice cold and certain, "I know you won't say no." That night, Peter collapsed onto his bed, exhausted, not physically, but mentally. His thoughts spiraled in frantic circles, a collision of exhilaration and terror. Gloria had offered him $100,000. The number itself barely made sense in his head. It was more money than he had ever seen in his lifetime. But in exchange, he had to murder a child. Kevin, a boy who had never done anything to deserve this. A boy Peter had always felt sorry for, maybe even related to in some way. His own childhood had been much the same. Neglected parents, lonely nights spent drowning out their arguments with music. Kevin, like him, had spent years chasing love that would never come. Peter tossed and turned for hours, unable to quiet his conscience. He knew this was something he could never undo. The guilt would be unbearable. People said acts like this changed a man forever. But still, money. Gloria had made it easy for him. "Do it however you want," she had said, "just as long as he's gone." He considered the methods. A bullet to the head, quick and nearly painless, but far from quiet. And he didn't own a gun anyway. Strangulation. No, too so personal. Too brutal, a slit throat. Yes, that could work. Fast, clean, and efficient. The heart would pump the blood out in seconds. And the pain. How bad could it really be? Kids skinned their knees all the time, didn't they? This would be no different, just a thinner, cleaner cut. It was perfect. Almost. Something still felt wrong. If he was going to do this, he needed a way to make it easier on himself. He needed Kevin to never know who had done it. Peter sat up in bed, exhaling a long breath. Sleep was useless. He reached for his nightstand, pulled out a pack of cigarettes and lit one. By the time he had burned through 3, the plan had solidified in his mind. The perfect way to kill Kevin Collins. It took him a week to prepare himself mentally and to push aside whatever remnants of morality still clung to him. But eventually the moment arrived. He was driving deep into the wilderness of Scotland County. The back seat was filled with the excited chatter of a 9-year-old boy who, for once in his life, felt special. Kevin had barely known Peter before today, but now he looked up at him with a newfound admiration. After all, how often did an adult care enough to take a kid camping? Especially when his own parents never had. "Sir," Kevin piped up from the back seat, his voice bright with curiosity. "Why are we doing this again?" Peter kept his eyes on the road, forcing a casual tone. "Well, Kevin, your parents wanted a little time to themselves, so they asked me to take you on a trip." Kevin leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "A trip to where?" Peter hesitated for the briefest of moments. Then he smiled. "Oh, man, I know we're going camping, but where exactly? What are we going to do?" Peter glanced at Kevin through the rearview mirror, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "We're heading to the Little PD River," he replied, keeping his voice light. "Just the two of us. Getting to know each other, living like real men for a bit." Kevin beamed, his excitement bubbling over. "And ghost stories. We're telling ghost stories, right?" Peter felt something twist in his gut. "Of course," he said, forcing a smile. "What's a campfire without a few creepy stories?" Kevin let out a delighted squeal. Peter winced. He had loved scary stories at that age too. Just like Kevin, he had grown up with parents who barely noticed him. Had he worn glasses as a kid? He thought about it for a moment. Yeah, he had, until he switched to contacts. Absent-mindedly, he reached up and touched his face, as if adjusting an invisible pair of spectacles. For a fleeting second, doubt crept in. Was he really going to go through with this? The guilt was already gnawing at him. but he forced himself to stay calm, to stick to the plan. Everything would unfold just as he intended. Meanwhile, Kevin rummaged through his backpack and pulled out a worn, dog-eared copy of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. "I brought this," he said excitedly. Peter forced a chuckle. "Let's wait until it's dark before we dive into that." "Okay." Kevin nodded eagerly. "Okay, sure. Hey, do you have any ghost stories?" "Yeah," Peter said. "Plenty, here's your book." Kevin asked, reaching for Peter's backpack. Peter tensed. "Hey, don't touch that, okay, buddy?" He gestured toward his head. "All the stories I know are in here." Kevin quickly pulled his hand back, looking slightly embarrassed. Peter exhaled slowly, relieved. If the boy had unzipped the bag, he might have seen things that raised suspicion. Latex gloves, rope, lighter fluid, a knife. Then again, Kevin probably would have just assumed they were camping supplies. He was overthinking this. Soon, they arrived at their destination, pulling off to the side of the road before gathering their gear and heading into the woods. It wasn't long before they reached the Little PD River. The water was so still that, from a certain angle, it almost looked like a pond. Calm, deep, undisturbed, a perfect place to dispose of a body. It had been nearly 36 years since Peter had last been camping, and Kevin had even less experience. It took them over an hour to set up their tent, and by the time they were unpacking their things, the sky was already shifting to dusk. "Can we tell ghost stories now?" Kevin asked eagerly. Peter glanced at the horizon. "Let's get the fire going first. By the time it's roaring, it'll be dark enough." "Yes," Kevin whispered, himself fist pumping in excitement. Peter instructed him to gather kindling, dry leaves, twigs, anything that would help ignite the flames. Though Peter wasn't an experienced camper, he had done his research beforehand. After all, burning a backpack full of someone's belongings required a decent fire. Kevin was diligent, eagerly collecting everything Peter asked for. Once they had enough, Peter carefully arranged large stones in a ring, placed the kindling in the center, and stacked sticks into a lean-to formation. Kevin watched, wide-eyed, clearly impressed. Finally, Peter struck a match, tossing it into the dry grass nestled beneath the sticks. Within moments, the fire caught, crackling and spreading into a flickering blaze. The wind stirred through the trees, and the flames let out a low, hungry roar. "Wow!" Kevin murmured, mesmerized. Peter lowered himself onto the ground beside the fire, watching the flames dance. Then he turned to Kevin and said, "Go on, grab your book. Read me a story." Kevin obeyed, eagerly flipping through his book, reading one chilling tale after another. His enthusiasm was unmistakable. With every gruesome or terrifying passage, his voice would dip into an exaggerated whisper, his words laced with excitement. The stories were filled with horror, rotting corpses unearthed from shallow graves, decapitated heads appearing in unexpected places, vengeful spirits returning from the dead, and even nightmarish cannibalistic butchers. But Peter remained unmoved. He had his own story, one that would truly shake Kevin to his core. "All right, stop there," Peter interrupted just as Kevin reached the middle of a tale about a ghost with bloodied fingers. "What? Why?" "This is the last one," Kevin protested. "Don't worry about it," Peter said, flashing a slight smile. "I've got a story for you, a real one. A true ghost story, and it takes place right here, by the Little PD River." Kevin's eyes widened. "Oh man, do you swear it's true?" Peter chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, it's true. When I was your age, my father told me this story. I even told it to my entire Boy Scout troop, and it scared every last one of them shitless." He paused, watching Kevin's reaction. The boy didn't flinch at the profanity, just leaned forward in eager anticipation. "And now," Peter continued, "I think it's only right that I tell it to you." "Yeah, do it," Kevin practically squealed, his voice light and breathy, like a child about to unwrap a long-awaited birthday gift. Reaching into his backpack, he pulled out a bag of marshmallows. He speared one onto a stick, carefully lowering it over the fire, eyes still fixed on Peter. "All right," Peter said, settling in. I'll tell the story, but let's keep the interruptions to a minimum, okay? Kevin nodded enthusiastically. Peter took a breath and began. This is the story of the Lord of Lies. That wasn't his real name, of course. Just a nickname, like Bloody Mary or something along those lines. But the man at the center of this story, his real name was Joseph Thorne. Now, Joseph wasn't all that unusual, except for one thing, his eyes. His irises were bright red, the kind of unnatural shade that made people uneasy. But other than that, he was just a regular guy. Back in the 1930s, Joseph lived in a small town not far from here. Every day after work, he'd come down to this very river, hauling his fishing gear, and spend hours casting his line, letting the water and the quiet wash over him. He had a good life, a normal life. He was married to Barbara Thorne, the most beautiful woman in town. People said her laugh was like a song, so sweet it could put mockingbirds to shame. But beauty doesn't always mean loyalty. By 1942, America was in chaos. The war was raging, and the draft was pulling men away from their families. Joseph was one of them. He left home to fight just like so many others. And while he was gone, Barbara grew lonely. Some women wait years, lifetimes, for their husbands to return. But Barbara, she wasn't that kind of woman. She found comfort in the arms of another man. Her next door neighbor, Kenneth Carl. Kenneth hadn't been drafted. He couldn't be. He was an invalid. Kevin suddenly piped up. What's an invalid? Peter exhaled slowly as Kevin's marshmallow caught fire. The boy frantically blew on it, trying to salvage the golden crispiness before it turned to ash. It means someone who's too weak or sick to do normal things, Peter explained. Someone with a serious illness or injury. Kenneth was in a wheelchair. I don't remember why exactly. My father told me once, but I've forgotten. Kevin nodded, returning his focus to the marshmallow, carefully twisting it over the flames. At first, Barbara was just helping Kenneth out, Peter continued. He usually had a hired caretaker, but that man got drafted too. So Barbara stepped in. She'd check on him, help around his house, run errands for him, but then things changed. One act of kindness turned into another, then another, and soon Barbara and Kenneth weren't just neighbors anymore. They were lovers. And when Joseph finally came home, he wasn't the same man who had left. The war had changed him. Joseph Thorne was no longer the cheerful fisherman the townspeople had known and loved. The war had stripped away that part of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out version of the man he once was. Distant, unsettled, and when word of his wife's betrayal reached him, as it always does in small towns, it only made things worse. Now, imagine that. Imagine surviving the horrors of war, returning home with the hope of finding comfort, only to learn that the person you fought to come back to had given up on you. It was a cruel twist of fate, and Joseph took it hard. He spent days, weeks, down by the little PD River, fishing from dawn until dusk. Some people even whispered that he never went home, that he slept by the water, his line cast into the current long after the sun had set. But he wasn't just fishing, he was planning, he was plotting his revenge. Kevin, who had been silent until now, couldn't hold back. What did he do? He asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Peter smiled slightly. I'm getting to that. One day, Joseph finally confronted Barbara. As soon as he mentioned Kenneth's name, she broke down, collapsing into tears, sobbing into her hands. And as she wept, Joseph leaned in close, his voice low and steady. Don't worry, he told her. It's going to be all right. Then, before she could react, he slipped his fillet knife from his belt and reached beneath her arms and sliced open her throat. Peter let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching as Kevin processed what he had just heard. Then he continued. Joseph didn't stop with Barbara. He walked straight to Kenneth's house. By then, Barbara had dismissed the hired helper, so there was no one else inside. It was easy for Joseph to break in. He simply cut a slit in the screen door, reached in, unlatched the lock, and stepped inside. He found Kenneth asleep. But not for long. As soon as Joseph loomed over him, Kenneth woke with a start. He saw the glint of the knife, saw the fury in Joseph's red eyes, and immediately began calling for help. Joseph hushed him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, staring him dead in the eye. "Calm down," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." And then, swift as lightning, he drew his knife across Kenneth's throat. That night, Joseph waited until darkness had swallowed the town before dragging both bodies down to the river. He wrapped them tightly in a tarp, securing them to the heaviest stone he could find. Then, with a final heave, he rolled them into the black water. The fish would eat well for the next few days. Kevin cast an uneasy glance toward the river. "Boot," he said hesitantly, his voice small. Peter continued, ignoring him. It wasn't long before the bodies were discovered. Two little boys had been playing by the river, having a contest to see who could find the most interesting thing at the bottom. It was a game Peter himself had played as a kid. You dive down, grab whatever you can find, and bring it back up. Sometimes it was coins, sometimes jewelry. But that day, one of the boys resurfaced clutching something far worse, a severed, rotting human finger. Horrified, he ran straight home and showed his mother. Within hours, the police were at the river, questioning the boy and searching the waters for more remains. And that's when they saw him. Joseph was there, standing waist deep in the river, waiting for them. The police had no idea he was the murderer, not yet. To them, he was just a man standing in the water, staring at the current. They called out to him, warned him to step away, but he didn't listen. He just kept walking, deeper and deeper, until the river swallowed him whole. The officers rushed forward, but by the time they reached the water's edge, Joseph was gone. A minute passed, then 10. He never resurfaced. Peter stopped abruptly. Kevin sat frozen, staring at him expectantly. Then he frowned. "Wait, that can't be the end," he protested. "That's not the end, right?" Peter met Kevin's gaze, his expression unreadable. "No," he admitted. "It's not." Kevin swallowed. What happened next? Peter leaned in slightly. Joseph's body was never found. Kevin's breath hitched. His eyes widened. "You said this really happened," he whispered. Peter nodded. "Oh, it did. And some people say that's why no one ever found his body, because the river absorbed his spirit." Kevin shuddered, glancing once again at the black, rippling water beside them. "Do you know why they called Joseph the Lord of Lies?" Peter asked, his voice low and measured. Kevin shook his head, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "It's because he always lied to his victims before killing them. Think about his last words to Barbara and Kenneth." Peter continued, leaning in slightly. "Legend has it, the Lord of Lies awakens whenever he senses someone impure camping near the little PD. You'll fall asleep, only to be jolted awake seconds later. A cold hand clamped over your mouth so you can't scream. You'll hear Joseph's whisper, 'Don't worry, it'll be okay,' right before your throat is slit and your body is dragged down into the river. Forever." In the flickering firelight, Peter couldn't be certain, but it seemed like the blood had drained from Kevin's face. He'd told the story well. No surprise, considering he'd practiced it in front of a mirror for days. "Yes, sir, I'm kind of scared," Kevin admitted, his voice trembling. "He kid," Peter said, forcing a reassuring smile. "No need to worry, it's just a story, I promise." "But you said it was real," Kevin insisted, his brows furrowing in concern. "It really happened, sure," Peter conceded. "But there's no Lord of Lies. I can promise you that. And even if there was, why would he be interested in you? Come on, what's the worst thing you've ever done?" Kevin seemed to relax a little at that, his shoulders slumping slightly. Peter kept up the warm smile, though inside his stomach churned. "It's getting late," he said, his tone gentle. "You should get some sleep. I'll be right outside if you need me." "Good night, sir," Kevin muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion as he crawled into his tent. "See you in the morning." Peter watched him go, sitting motionless by the fire for a moment longer. Then, with a deep breath, he unzipped his backpack. One by one, he pulled on the latex gloves, the material stretching tight over his fingers, a second skin. From the bag, he retrieved the small paring knife, the closest he could get to a fillet knife, and placed it on the ground beside his sleeping bag. His heart hammered in his chest as he pressed the start button on a stopwatch, beginning the agonizing wait. As the hour ticked by, Peter's mind raced. He could stop this, right here, right now. He could crawl into his own sleeping bag, close his eyes, and pretend this was just a normal camping trip. But then, the memory of the money, the promise of the 100,000, flashed in his mind, and the nosy rose again, a bitter taste at the back of his throat. The 100,000. The number chanted through his mind, a relentless drumbeat. The 100,000. With each repetition, he steeled himself, forcing his trembling legs to carry him toward Kevin's tent. Knife in hand, his grip so tight it hurt. Peter knelt by the entrance, his breath shallow and quick. It'll be over soon, he told himself, trying to believe it. And then I'll have my money. He reached out, fingers trembling as he peeled back the flap of the tent. Firelight spilled over Kevin's face, illuminating the soft, peaceful expression of a child lost in dreams. His lips curled into the faintest of smiles, his chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. Peter's hand hovered over Kevin's throat, the knife poised, as he hesitated, caught between his desperation and his conscience. Peter lifted Kevin's head, inch by inch, until the boy's neck was resting against his knee. Now, Kevin wouldn't be able to see him, just shadows, just a faceless figure in the dark. To Kevin, this wouldn't be the betrayal of someone he trusted. It would be the work of a stranger, a monster. It was now or never. Before he could hesitate, Peter clamped a firm hand over Kevin's mouth. Kevin's eyes snapped open, wild with terror. He let out a muffled scream, but it was swallowed by Peter's grip. "Don't worry," Peter growled, his voice lower than usual, rough with forced malice. "It'll be all right." Then, before Kevin could struggle free, Peter drove the paring knife across his throat. The blade bit deep. Kevin bucked, thrashing violently in reflex, but the movement only made the wound worse. The gash yawned wider, spilling a torrent of crimson down his chest, drenching the tent in a brilliant, pulsing red. The boy made one last, desperate attempt to cry out, but all that escaped was a weak, rasping sound, pathetic cross between a moan and a whimper. Peter held him there, and held him, and held him. Even when Kevin's body stilled, Peter didn't move, his own breath shallow. A sick, irrational fear gnawed at the back of his mind. What if Kevin wasn't dead? What if, the moment he stepped away, the boy suddenly lurched back to life, gasping, screaming, but Kevin remained motionless. Only then did Peter finally let go. His limbs trembled as he stood, his breath uneven. It was done. Still shaking, he stumbled back to his backpack, reaching inside and pulling out the coil of rope. Slinging it over his shoulder, he turned back to the tent, grabbed Kevin's limp ankles and dragged him outside. The effort left him wheezing, but he pushed forward, hauling the boy's body through the dirt, the lifeless form leaving a dark smear in its wake. By the time he reached the edge of the river, his muscles burned. There, just a few feet away, lay a large rock. Half the size of Kevin's corpse, it would do. Peter staggered over to it, gripping its rough, damp surface and heaved with all his might. With difficulty, he managed to roll it beside Kevin's body. For the next several minutes, he worked, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he bound the boy to the stone with the rope, tightening each knot with meticulous precision. When it was done, Peter stood over the bundled corpse, his hands shaking from exertion. One last push. Bracing himself, he pressed his full weight against the rock, shoving it forward. Kevin's body slid across the mud, the stone dragging him toward the water, and then, just like that, he was gone. The river swallowed him whole, the glassy surface barely rippling as the weight pulled him under. Peter didn't allow himself to linger. He turned back toward the camp, wiping sweat from his brow, his pulse still hammering in his ears. There was one more thing left to do. He gathered up every trace of Kevin, his backpack, his sleeping bag, his worn copy of scary stories to tell in the dark, and tossed them into the fire. The flames hungrily devoured them, crackling and hissing as the last remnants of the boy burned to ash. Then, methodically, Peter dismantled the tent. He folded it neatly, stuffing it into Kevin's camping bag, before tossing that into the fire as well. By the time the last embers of Kevin's presence had turned to smoke, Peter exhaled slowly. It was over, and Kevin would never know who had truly killed him. The plan had worked, and yet a strange hollowness settled inside Peter. He had known from the start that Kevin reminded him of himself. Too much, maybe. A boy desperate for love, living in a world that never gave it to him. In a way, Peter had just killed the child he once was. He had the sudden urge to reach for the pack of cigarettes in his pocket, to light one and let the smoke settle his nerves. But then he hesitated. A cigarette would leave evidence, proof that he had been here. No, he had to be smarter than that. His exhaustion hit him all at once. His body axed, his mind spun, and his eyes were heavy. He stripped off the blood-soaked latex gloves and peeled away his ruined pants. Then, curling up by the fire, he slipped into his sleeping bag. Within moments, he was asleep to Peter didn't stir when the river began to ripple, didn't flinch when the normally calm surface of the water churned, distorting under the weight of something rising. Red eyes gleamed in the darkness. The fire, once a beacon of warmth, was dying rapidly, its flame shrinking, flickering lower and lower, until all that remained was smoldering embers. Then, finally, nothing. The night was swallowed in black. The cold crept in. Heavy footfalls echoed between the trees, slow and deliberate. Water dripped from a figure that did not belong in this world, pooling in the dirt, soaking into the earth. A hand, slick and ice cold, clamped down over Peter's mouth. His body jerked awake. He tried to scream. The hand tightened, shoving him down, holding him in place. The scent of wet decay filled his nostrils, suffocating, inescapable. And then a whisper, low, rough, rotten. Don't worry, Peter's blood ran cold. It'll be all right. The last thing he felt was the jagged edge of a rusted fillet knife gliding across his throat. Then, nothing.